that you're two divorced men who kind of saw a need, and you correct me if I'm wrong, to have that voice heard and what it's like to be divorced. And I do think that this is a side of divorce that we need to hear about more. Many of us can't even define what we're feeling. But to me, one of the most hurtful things is, if I'm honest, my experience has been that we don't even allow men to have them. Like, we have decided that somehow men are not human. Like, having emotions ideally actually is a human experience.
Welcome to the Too Dad to Quit podcast.
The podcast where we highlight stories of dads on the other side of divorce.
To inspire and give strength to dads going through it.
I'm Ben.
And I'm Yoel.
Hey everybody, Ben here. I just wanted to let everybody know this is an episode of Too Dad to Quit podcast. However, it is our guest spot. Yoel and I had our first interview on another podcast, the Very Thoughtful podcast, and we thought it was very important to share it with you. It is a very interesting perspective from the female perspective, and gets a lot into the fact that men actually have feelings. And a lot of, in our society today, that's not something that's pushed or brought about, or it goes pretty deep, and it's a wonderful conversation, and we wanted to share it with you. So enjoy this week's episode.
Welcome everyone to my Very Thoughtful World. I am Caneisha with Very Thoughtful Life Coaching. I am super excited today. Listen, we are changing it up a little bit here at Very Thoughtful. We're going to talk to men the whole month of June. And what better guests to start with is Ben and Yoel. They are here joining us from their own podcast, Too Dad to Quit. I can't wait to hear more about them, and I can't wait for you to learn more about them. So let's get started. Ben, Yoel, please let everyone know who you are.
Yoel, you've got the beard.
Oh, thanks, Ben. Who I am, that's a very deep question, but just a brief background. I'm a 43-year-old man. I'm a father of 5 children. I'm originally from Canada, Toronto to be specific, and currently residing in Jerusalem. I moved here about 15 years ago, and I got divorced roughly 3 years ago as of the date of this recording. And professionally, my background is as an attorney, but now I'm also a professional podcaster along with my co-host, Ben, and I'll turn it over to you, Ben.
So I'm Ben. I like to think of myself as a creator. But sometimes you have to make money, and you need a real job too. So for the moment, I'm very involved in a startup that deals with accessibility, digital accessibility on the web. That's my day job. And my night job, we're part of this podcast, trying to help divorced fathers and fathers that are thinking about divorce. We can get into our demographics, which isn't entirely divorced fathers. I also have 5 children. I've been divorced for 3 years, and I also write children's books, and I have a YouTube channel, a travel vlog showing local spots around Israel, and I have a few other things as well. So like I said, I don't sleep, and I try to create and think outside the box as much as possible.
That sounds wonderful. How did you all meet?
Yeah, so part of our education is we take a year abroad. So we both ended up in Israel, and we were in different schools, but a lot of our friends overlapped, and we both were big rollerbladers at the time. And anytime Yoel and I got together, in my opinion, and his may be different, I thought we hit it off, and he's always been on my, if I ever meet that guy again, we will be best friends. And back then there was no WhatsApp, there was no, there was just cell phones, and that was it. So staying in touch wasn't a thing. And then I ended up moving to Israel. I saw an ad for one of his businesses here, and I got in touch, and he's like, yeah, we should get together. It never happened. And then it had to be 3, 4, 5 years later. We were Facebook friends by then. And I saw this picture of him showing off his abs. And I was like, oh, what's going on? And it was sort of around the same time as my divorce. And I reached out to him. I was like, hey, what's up? And ever since then, we've been trying to support each other through this time.
Wow. Yoel, did you want to add something to that?
No, that was a pretty good synopsis. I like that summary for sure. And yeah, I was going to say, and Ben kind of alluded to it. It's the joys of WhatsApp, and that's actually allowed me to stay in touch with many long lost friends who aren't long lost anymore. And that's also been a big part of my experience post divorce. I talk a lot about this. I actually wrote a book as well for men to help with that talks about personal development, different actions that men can take and whatnot. And a lot of that has to do with sharing with other friends. And WhatsApp has enabled me to stay in touch and renew or rekindle friendships that I think otherwise wouldn't have been possible. So Ben definitely falls under that, and it's been a huge blessing to have Ben as a good close friend of mine, and now to do this podcast together.
That's beautiful. So tell people, I know that your podcast, at least what little bit I read about it, because I don't want to make a big assumption, that you're two divorced men who kind of saw a need, and you correct me if I'm wrong, to have that voice heard and what it's like to be divorced. First and foremost, how long were you married? And what made you all think to start this podcast?
So personally, I was married for just shy of 14 years, 5 kids, and I'm in a foreign country. I don't have any family here, and just finding support was very difficult. Luckily, I had some close friends that pulled me into their divorce circle, which I didn't know existed, and it was also during COVID. So you couldn't go out, and there were like these underground groups where we got on Zoom and we talked to each other, so we all weren't alone in our houses when the kids weren't there. And there was clearly something missing. And from talking to other people in this group, the women had a lot of things to lean on. They had organizations that were offering to get them things. People were raising money for single mothers. The town had social services for them. And for us, it was kind of like I did. A lot of divorced men after divorce, they move into their parents' houses. I didn't have that option. I moved into my friend's house. I lived in his spare bedroom. I left with a suitcase, and I started from basically nothing. And so it was about rebuilding, and talking to Yoel and other divorced men. I realized we all kind of have the same stories or the same emotions and it was the same story over and over again. But I feel like there's a lot of men going through divorce that don't know that because they didn't have the community that we had. And I wanted to make a bigger community where people can share stories, but in a positive, uplifting way. I've lived many lives already. And so I wasn't really concerned about me figuring out the next chapter, but it was about being able to show other people that you can still get through, because it's hard. I remember dropping my kids off at their mother's house and just standing outside going nowhere because I had nowhere to go. And that feeling, I changed from, I'm an optimist and I write. So like in my head, I have all these stories and I have like, this is what I want to do and this is what I'm going to do. But at some point I just had to stop and just go, I'm going to accomplish one thing a day. Yeah. And that's it. And I can't think further than that. So, just having people on the podcast and showing divorced guys that have made it through to the other side and gone through the court system and gone through all of that and stayed in their children's lives, it's worth it. And to show them that it's worth it, because during that time, it can be, touch and go and it's a lot. So knowing that sacrifice in the end, having that relationship with your kids. And my parents got divorced when I was 8 months old. So I know firsthand what it is like to be that kid. And I never knew my parents married really. And I still blame myself the whole time. So like, just knowing how, my father has his own story, and I hope to get him on the podcast. We're still negotiating. But for the first, most of until I was like 18, I wasn't really close with my father. I'd see him once a month. But now we're close. So if he disappeared completely and just ran away, like a lot of fathers just give up and they're like, it's not worth it. And they just go. And then that relationship is gone. And that relationship is so important. So, which is, kind of the whole idea of the, even the name of the podcast. It actually started, and I'm jumping. This hat is what started the whole idea.
What is it?
Fathers Matter. It says
Okay,
Fathers Matter.
I agree.
And it was just like well, of course they do, but
Right.
not everybody feels that way. Like, I questioned everything. My fathering, my ability to love, do my kids like me, like everything. And it was just a way to get that message out to as many fathers as possible, that they do matter and they should stay involved no matter what the heartache is and what the troubles are. And we've had several men on the podcast just admit that they'd be walking around their kitchen and just break down crying. And it's not, we talked about before the podcast, like showing the emotions of a man, but
Yeah.
it happens. And after post-divorce, it happens a lot. I heard this one thing in a movie that divorce is not just breaking up of a relationship and the death of a relationship. It's also the death of the future you imagined.
Yeah.
So it's really two deaths, and that's hard.
Yeah.
So just to be able to show guys that are able to get through that, and the feedback has been amazing. And every week we get more and more, reaching more and more people, and we have other things coming, and we'll get into kind of what ideas are coming your way.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. And I do think that this is a side of divorce that we need to hear about more. Because, and I'm from America. We lived abroad for 10 years. I also grew up in a home where, like, much like you, my parents were never married, but I thought they had been married because I was very young. But knowing what that feels like to grow up this very divided world. So y'all, I want to make sure I give you an opportunity to share with me your story as well.
Oh yeah, I appreciate that, Caneisha. By the way, I'm curious, where are you from originally?
So I'm
just curious.
originally from North Carolina, a very small town in
all
North
right.
Carolina.
Nice.
Spent we lived 3 years in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates.
Wow.
Cool.
Yeah, in Al-Ain. I don't know if you guys heard of Al-Ain, between Abu Dhabi and Dubai. Then we spent 7 years in Beijing, China.
Wow. World traveler.
Yeah, a little bit, but we didn't get to go to Israel. And what do you guys, when you guys in Jerusalem?
Yeah, I'm in Jerusalem. Yeah, and Ben's not too far away in the suburb outside of Jerusalem. But just to answer your question, similar to Ben, I was married for many years. I was married for actually literally 18. So the day of my official divorce was actually my 18th anniversary. And also similar to Ben, and like he was saying, a lot of our stories overlap. I also found myself at a certain point, living out of a shoebox. My friend had, put me up in a room in his office. I was there for, a period of time. And yeah, divorce was a very dark time in my life. The interesting thing that I'll add, to what Ben was saying is that, Ben really had to sell me, and he still has to sell me all the time. We have lots of discussions, obviously, because one of my concerns was, and Ben has heard this a zillion times, we're not victims. Like, neither of us are here today to say that we're victims, or we don't want to have this victim approach. Like Ben was saying, we're here to take a positive approach. But I always have that concern. Like I don't want to ever give that impression that we're suggesting that we're victims in any way. So that was definitely a concern of mine, and I wanted to make that clear. And also, just from the standpoint of defining oneself. So I did have a concern. When I was initially talking about it with Ben, am I going to be defining myself by this? Like a divorce is a very challenging, life-altering time in one's life. I never noticed it. I never realized it, having not experienced it before. And once I experienced it, it was like, wow, like it rocks your world. And so I definitely have had some reservations about that. But as you heard from Ben, the positives are just so important, and it's just so crucial for people to really have that, that voice, to really see that there's other men out there like them that have gone through it and have come out the other side. And Ben has won me over, and he wins me over all the time whenever I find myself, asking him, like, are you sure we should be doing this, or is this the right thing? And but it's been amazing.
I am sitting here, believe it or not, like so emotionally full. So I don't know if you guys know this about me, but with my coaching, all I talk about is emotional awareness. And because a lot of times we don't really communicate our real emotions. Many of us can't even define what we're feeling. But to me, one of the most hurtful things is, if I'm honest, my experience has been that we don't even allow men to have them. Like, we have decided that somehow men are not human. Like, having emotions ideally actually is a human experience. But we are not a society, and I can only speak from America and from my experience of being around different people from different cultures. I've lived around the world, but coached people from around the world. And to hear women talk, to watch movies, the fact that you both just shared that for you, divorce meant moving in with a parent or living on someone's sofa. When you watch movies, when the divorce happened, the husband, has a business and he moves in with his young girlfriend, and the mom is stuck and she's trying to figure it out. We don't hear these stories enough. And we certainly don't allow space for the man who is going through divorce to say it matters that they're suffering and hurting too. And I'll share this because I don't want to take up the whole time talking about my experience of divorce. Years ago, I worked for an organization called Church Initiative, and the man Steve Grissom created a Christian program called Divorce Care, because when he was faced with divorce, going from church to church, going to ministries, going to therapists, no one could help this man. And once he got through it and, resolved, he said, he prayed, Lord, there should be something to help them. He said, God said, well, then you create it. But just to know that you're right. We don't live in a society where there's a lot of support, one, for people going through divorce. And then two, I'm never, like, when I was reading your stuff on your internet, I was like, I can't wait to talk to these men. Can't wait, because I have never been on the other side of this conversation, and I am very honored to be here.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about society and what's around. I have this theory, like, it used to be Disney movies created this imaginary thing where you marry a princess, marries the king, and they live happily ever after. And this got ingrained in young children, mostly the girls. This was like their, I'm going to grow up, I'm going to marry a prince and everything, live happy ever after. But I feel like now there's also now the whole Hallmark movie culture, and they're slipping into that now, where it's second marriages, it's third marriages, and all of this is normal and everything's going to be great. And I feel like there's a push that trying to normalize. I understand, it just shouldn't be, like an outsider thing that is ostracized, but there's also, normalizing divorce and second marriages. This is just what people do. And the second time it's better because they land better, they find somebody better, and everybody takes vacations together, and everybody, happily ever after, all together, 400 people, the Brady Bunch is the standard. So I get what what you're saying there. I believe Yoel is sort of writing a screenplay, which I really want him to do, which may fit this need.
Yeah.
I'm working on it, albeit pretty slowly, but it is something I'm working on. But Caneisha, I also wanted to add to what you were saying about emotional awareness, because a big part of what we're hoping for in the podcast is also to have that awareness. Hopefully there's people, as we continue to grow and reach, more and more people that are currently married and maybe having challenges, whether that's, on the wife's side or the husband's side, whichever side of the spectrum, but just to understand that, there may be another perspective. And if they can see that, guys have emotions too. Guys, plenty of our guests have talked about crying about things, and plenty of our, and the thing I want to add also is that a lot of times we may not be that conscious while it's happening. But if somebody could witness guys on the other side who have sort of developed that consciousness, then that could help them while they're still married, if that makes sense. So in other words, like, I have a certain level of consciousness now just based on, various books and, work I like to think that I'm doing on myself and trying to grow from the experience that I didn't necessarily, or not even necessarily, I didn't have before. So at least somebody who's watching it and sees somebody speaking more consciously may realize there's something more to it. So if somebody's struggling in a marriage, they may say to themselves, I want to reach out to somebody who's been there and understands, what it's like. And just to see that perspective, I'm very grateful to hear you say that, because that's very much a part of what we're hoping for, what we're aiming for. Right, Ben, would you say?
Yeah, and we actually had one guest that's a marriage therapist he's divorced, married, has kids from his first marriage, her first marriage, and they have kids together. And he said this thing that still sticks with me, that the ideal is that couples have their second marriage in their first marriage.
Explain that.
Yeah, so the enlightenment that you get after divorce and introspection and working on yourself and giving yourself the space to figure out what you want and what not, you should do that in your first marriage. Mm-hmm. So instead of needing this divorce and to do it be better in your second marriage, you should figure out how to do that in your first marriage.
Yeah.
And that's the ideal, because, if you get married in your 20s and you're hoping to live to your 80s, those are your choices, really.
Yeah.
You figure it out or you don't, and then you try again.
Yeah.
So the ideal is, there was something that started it. Ideally, you figure that out the first time. But the way he said it to me was just like, oh man, that makes total sense. The other thing about demographics, so most of our 70% of our listeners are between the ages of 35 and 44.
Okay.
And that is, in our circles and online, that's the age when we're seeing these people divorcing. Mm-hmm. And to us, it's no coincidence. And also, as far as listeners, so we know some of our female listeners, like we have some very, very, someone said to us that she wants to hear what the other side thinks, exactly like you said. But 20% of our listeners are female. And to us, that was shocking. But it's been consistent since we started. And yeah, so we're, I think we both have had people reach out to us that are going through a tough time in their marriage. And so I'll send like specific episodes, or now we started a clips channel, so I'll send specific clips to them. Actually, someone just mentioned to me last week that they wanted to go to the opera, but her boyfriend doesn't want to go. And so we had one guest who gave the story about this husband who didn't want to go to the opera. And then finally he was like, yes. And they went to the opera. And after the opera, they had the best time of their entire lives. And the next day he bought season tickets to the opera. Wow. So it's just, everyone has different insights. And it's been really amazing. And something that we do on the podcast is each guest, we ask them for a too dad to quit moment. So a moment when they were most, proud to be a father, or when, when they think about it, they just light up. And that's every episode. So even, the toughest and the hardest person for us to crack and get into their mind during the podcast, when you mention this moment, like we had a family attorney on and he was like, I don't know, I'm just a dad. And we gave him, enough time. And finally he came out with it. And he was like, I saw my kid in school and I looked at him and I was like, that was me 20 years ago. It was the coolest thing I've ever seen. So just to show these dads that, like, you have to appreciate those moments no matter what. We're tapping into something that, a lot of the fathers are out working. And I used to be a weekend dad. I'd go to work and leave before the kids got up, and I came home after they were sleeping, and I'd see them only on the weekend. But even in those situations, those too dad to quit moments exist. Yeah. And it's so important for fathers to understand that and feel validated that they're doing their job when they can.
I agree. And so many questions I want to ask. I just wish I had way more time with you all. It's just, I can't even express to you how overjoyed I am, because 12 years into my own marriage, my husband and I thought we would end up in divorce. And we just happened to be living in the desert. I'm a Christian. And I was like, okay, There's no bigger example of when people come to the desert, you either die or transform. And the reason we stuck together was because I heard Dr. Phil say,
Wow.
you're going to divorce well. And I said, listen, let's go. You go to therapy. I'm going to find someone to help me and figure out, do we like each other on the other side of this? And if we decide we like each other, but we like each other from a perspective of, I like you as a person, but maybe not as a husband or a wife, we can leave separate. But if we find out we still do like each other enough, we'll stick through. And that work you talked about earlier, Yoel, is exactly what we had to do. And it transformed everything, the emotional awareness, starting to recognize that we walked into marriage with some really, excuse my language, dumbass thinking. Like just, like what we thought
Don't we all?
was supposed to be, what we thought a wife was supposed to be. And thoughts that went unchallenged. And learning that we just had all these false beliefs and we had all these assumptions and all of these expectations that went uncommunicated. And that work going in there, I believe marriage can be for healing if you so choose to get into it for that reason. So when you said the comment about would you say he was a lawyer or someone who said that the first marriage is, I think
therapist.
The therapist. I think that's exactly what could happen. But here's the thing I think we have to do, and I love that you guys are doing this, is we got to let people know, like we got to warn people that this fuzzy butterfly fairy tale picture of marriage you're looking for doesn't exist. It's why I always say there's not a part 2 to Cinderella. Because they can't show you what they can't show you what happily ever after looks like. So they're like, we're never going to do a part 2. We're just going to keep redoing part 1.
That's great.
Nice. Yeah, they say that marriage is when one person quits at a time, but when you both quit at a time, that's divorce.
Oh, yeah. What is
so as long as one of them
is willing
as long as one of them isn't quitting, yeah.
What is something you want women to know, particularly about men when you have to be on the other side, when there is divorce, that you think sometimes we don't know or get or understand?
That's an excellent question. It's hard to generalize because obviously every woman is a unique person in and of herself, just like every guy is unique in and of himself, right? Some people are more emotional, some less. I think that a lot of times both sides, it's hard to answer the question just from the woman's perspective. I think it's important for both a man and a woman to understand that there is a lot of pain that people are coming at this process from. And it also depends on when you're talking about, like, are you talking about as the divorce is happening or as there's trouble in the marriage? It really depends on different times. But, to me, it's kind of hard to sort of tell somebody to have this, because in many ways, somebody either has the ability to be empathetic or empathic, if it's the right word. Ben and I were debating that, or not. Like, to me, it's, maybe it's because I have a legal training, and it's not to toot my own horn, but, I was kind of trained to always try and see things from the other point of view. And I feel like, just based on a lot of my experience with, in general, people I've spoken to, I think sometimes there's that kind of, people get closed up and they have an inability to try and at least try and understand where the other person is coming from. We get like a sort of tunnel vision, and that just leads to a lot of misunderstanding. It's there's a beautiful thing that I wish I had known about as the divorce was happening. I don't know if it would have changed anything, but have you heard of the term conscious uncoupling? Have you heard about that, Caneisha?
I have.
Yeah. So I love the concept. I'm not gonna, there's not enough time now. Anybody, any of your audience can Google it. But basically, there's this idea of having that sort of compassion. In other words, it doesn't have to be war. It doesn't have to be this sort of like me or you. Nobody wants divorce to happen. And we've talked a lot in this podcast about ways in which your second marriage could be built into your first marriage, which was obviously, from my point of view, and I think Ben's as well, I don't want to speak for him, the ideal. But if it is going to happen, I have just found that unfortunately people sort of get stuck into their own sort of mindset in their own world, and there isn't enough compassion. And again, your question was about women, and I'm not saying that's what woman versus man. It's a general answer that I think both sides to the equation, I think would be beneficial to focus on.
Yeah, that's good. And I asked that particularly because again, being in a circle, being that my coaching clients are women, being that I'm a woman, and that is who I'm used to being around. I promise you, the conversations I'm used to hearing about men, we have removed the ability for you all to feel, to hurt, to share that, to even consider that you are as affected by divorce that we are. I don't hear that. I don't hear the compassion for it. I don't even hear that there is even a consciousness. So that is why I particularly said we want women to hear and know, because I will admit, and I was shocked when I realized it, that having a son, being my oldest child, I remember he was younger. I took him to a movie that his father told me, he's going to be afraid of that. And I was like, no, you won't. And when my kid got in there with his little friend, they was like, let's get out of here. It occurred to me, I didn't let him have the emotion of fear because I thought he's a boy, he's tough, he's not going to be afraid. And so when I tell you, and I agree with you, like we can't say this about all women, but there has been a part, at least my generation, where maybe somewhere we didn't get the connection or the wiring that you guys have feelings too. And we tend to think that women that get divorced and they're left with the kids and they're the ones who have to struggle. And we think men are gone off having a blast because at least now they don't have to worry about the kids. So I am thankful that you have created a space where we can tune in and hear and listen and go, man, I can have now heart. One of the most powerful shows I saw years ago was when Oprah did Life Class with men of that fatherless sons or daddyless, something like that. And to hear those men talk about what did it mean to grow up without their fathers in their life? Because these aren't conversations, at least in America, we're not having. So that is why I particularly posed it that way. Because I do want the woman to listen to this and then tune in at a different place. That maybe bother her to hear. Why would Caneisha ask that question? Because sometimes we're not even aware of what we're not hearing because we're so in tune to what we already think that we refusing to hear what's being said.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that,
Sure.
that most fathers, I would say, want to be involved in their kids' lives.
Yeah.
And try to make the space for it, whatever that is. I know there are extreme cases, with abuse and things like that, but something else that's not talked about is the suicide rate amongst divorced fathers, which is crazy, because they end up, again, living on the street or living in their parents' house, not seeing their kids, being kept from their kids. And most of them want to be involved in some capacity, whatever it is. Of course, there's outliers, but give the opportunity, give the space, and know that the kid will be better with a father in their lives.
Absolutely. Well, listen, we're going to close on that. I want to thank you guys. I can't wait to go and start listening to more of your podcast. I started listening to it because I had to get to know you. I wanted to hear your voice, but I am excited to share this. I'm going to do all I can to spread the word. And I'm really thankful that you said yes to be a part of this podcast. So if you are watching, please tune in to Too Dad to Quit and learn more about what does it mean for a man to go through divorce. And let's now start having that conversation and allow space for the men, the boys, the sons, the fathers that are in our lives to create the space for that. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you guys for coming on.
That's beautiful,
Thank you.
Caneisha. Thank you. You're so inspiring. Thanks for having us.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you so much.
This podcast provides a platform for our guests to express their own personal views and opinions. Some or all of these views and opinions may not be shared by Ben and or Yoel.
Thank you for listening to the Too Dad to Quit podcast. Available at toodadtoquit.com. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode.